Greetings, folks. We are absolutely delighted to have Poti Duncan come in, and she's the Executive Director for Cybersecurity at the Treasury Board of Canada. And I'll just quickly go through her background. She's Executive Director, and she has over 20 years experience in the federal government. She currently leads the teams enabling the delivery of secure and reliable government services through the Governments of Canada Digital Identity Program, Enterprise Security Architecture, Security Strategy, and Policy Development. In 2020, she was named as one of the top women in cybersecurity in Canada. And prior to moving to TDS, she served in a variety of roles at Global Affairs Canada in various areas such as systems security engineering, architecture, and incident management. We're fortunate to have her speak at the conference. And also, I'd just like to make a pitch that we need more women in IT, okay? And certainly in the cyber side, we have a huge shortfall. Don't be afraid, get in there. So without further ado, Paul, over to you, and I look forward to making security boring again. Cheers.
Thank you, Bob, and hi, everybody. Bonjour à tous. Again, my name is Poti Duncan. I'm so glad to be here with you today. I would like to begin by acknowledging that as we are gathered today in Ottawa, the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Sorry, I'm just trying to, okay. So before we begin, I did want to provide an overview of our current state. Today, our focus is really on providing an overview of Government Canada's policy framework as it relates to cybersecurity in support of the GC's digital ambition. We have lots to talk about today in terms of the current state, the threat landscape, roles and responsibilities, strategy and plan, what we're doing about managing cyber events, and also measuring performance too. Government corporations, individuals are increasingly reliant on digital solutions, and the importance of conducting online business in a safe, secure, and reliable way has increased in concert with this reliance. Government security and the continuity of GC programs and services rely upon the ability of departments and agencies, as well as government as a whole, to manage security. And we need strong cybersecurity measures and practices in all aspects of the digital space to make our systems secure. So before, since this conference is all about digital transformation, I thought I would start off with a couple of memes. So if you're in the Twitterverse, I'm sure you've seen this one floating around. I don't think anybody saw COVID-19 pandemic coming, but definitely it's flipped our world around and certainly accelerated transformation. For example, from a Government Canada's perspective, it was all hands on deck to make sure that we maintained and operated our network to support operations and to make sure that we were able to continue delivering services to Canada and Canadians. And while some of you folks might have had some time to rest during lockdown, I can tell you right now, the folks in cybersecurity certainly did not. And we often joke that cyber never sleeps, but it's actually true. And so, not only has the pandemic kept us busy, but it's all these various cyber events that have impacted not just the GC, but globally as well. We've seen supply chain attacks, including those from sophisticated nation states. We've seen a rise in the number of zero-day vulnerabilities. And according to databases such as the Google's zero-day tracking project, there's been more recorded 0 days in 2021 than any other year on record. And of course, spear phishing continues to be an issue for us as well. So that's kind of at large in terms of the landscape. Some of you folks might also like the numbers. So here's some numbers from the recent Verizon data breach investigation report. It really echoes the events that I highlighted in the previous slide, where exploitation of the human element continues to be an issue as part of the vector of attacking our environments. We're seeing that increase in ransomware as well. And really that supply chain, we really need to protect our supply chain and really raise the bar for security, not within our own environment, but also across the ecosystem. So what does that mean in the Government of Canada's perspective? So I'll touch on a little bit of the landscape within Canada. In terms of the national cyber threats, we do work closely with our partners at the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, who are the technical authority for IT and cybersecurity in the Government of Canada. And in 2020, they published a national cyber threat assessment, which is available online at cyber.gc.ca. So some of the assessments and the judgments from that document, highlight the fact that cybercrime is a cyber threat that's most likely to affect Canadians and Canadian organizations. And really, when there's more connections, means more there's more physical safety at risk. There's more economic value at risk and more data that's collected, which is also a risk, and from a privacy perspective. So we have, the increasing number of threat actors, and increasingly they're becoming more and more sophisticated. We mentioned a little bit about ransomware. So ransomware is an impact on the government of Canada as well as Canada. I'm sorry, mostly on Canada, and definitely, those state-sponsored actors are, likely affecting our other critical infrastructure. All right. Again, touching on ransomware. Ransomware is the most common threat that Canadians face. It's on the rise. As you mentioned, during a ransomware attack, cyber criminals use malicious software to encrypt, steal, or delete data, and then demand a ransom payment to restore it. It does have severe impacts, including core business downtime, permanent data loss, intellectual property theft, privacy breaches, reputational damage, and is expensive to recover. And so really making sure that you put in the right security practices would really go a long way. Patch, patch, patch. And so there is definitely references available, such as the ransomware playbook, available from the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. Treasury Canada Secretariat has also published our guardrails for ransomware prevention and mitigation, really emphasizing, the putting in place preventative measures goes a long way. Supply chain threats. Supply chain refers to the processes required to design, manufacture, distribute equipment or other commodities. And it's really, the supply chain security is only as strong as its weakest link. It's really important that we protect not only our own services, but also the services within our supply chain. We're all in it together. We touched a little bit on the pandemic. And so it's made a profound impact on our country and our world. Whenever there's an event, those cyber criminals take advantage. And there's lots of, fake websites that stood up, fake, the phishing emails. And certainly the government of Canada has put a lot of measures in place to take down those bad sites and to really try to increase the awareness of not clicking on all those emails that come in and really thinking twice. It's about being preventive, right? So that's, for us, it's important to use corporate devices wherever possible. Those are managed and we have visibility in terms of what's on those desktops, and we're able to detect and prevent bad things happening as soon as they're identified. It's important that, even you keep your devices in sight, and when you're working in a public location, reporting on lost and stolen devices as soon as, you find that they're missing. Making sure you're updating your systems and using secure networks wherever possible. Also, it's important to protect those credentials that are used to access your systems. And so these are the best practices that I'll touch on later on. And so you'll hear these messages being repeated over and over again, and using things like MFA, super important in terms of protecting your credentials. So that's a little bit about the landscape. And so in terms of what are we doing in the government of Canada? Government security and the continuity of GC programs and services rely upon the ability of departments and agencies, as well as government as a whole, to manage security. And we all have a role to play. With respect to, from a national perspective, we have public safety, who really leads that sort of external facing perspective for cyber. Recently, they made an announcement on really trying to improve cyber and making sure that external organizations are reporting on cyber. And so we have public safety, D&D from a military perspective. We have our colleagues at the Communication Security Establishment, RCMP with their National Cybercrime Unit, as well as our other special partners. From a specialized perspective, we do have other federal agencies who work on other areas, such as Global Affairs Canada, which is where I came from, really looking at cybersecurity from the international perspective. We have PSPC, our Public Services and Procurement Canada branch, really looking at cyber from the procurement lens and making sure we're acquiring secure services and secure solutions. And of course, other organizations who support from the specialized perspective. Within the government of Canada, and where we sort of focus a lot from a Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat perspective, but we have what we call the tripartite. So that's comprised of TBS, Communication Security Establishment, and the sub-agency, the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, as well as Shared Services Canada. So we work closely together to make sure that we have that central voice for cybersecurity in the GC, and really trying to advance the security services that are offered, the direction, and provide advice and guidance to our departments. And departments themselves have a key role in terms of managing cybersecurity within their own organizations. So in the context of a department, there's several roles that folks play within a department. So we have deputy heads who really establish the departmental security governance, the roles and responsibilities, and they're really accountable ultimately for cyber and the management of security within the organization. They're supported by the Chief Information Officer, who leads the departmental IT, information, and data management functions. In addition, we have our Chief Security Officers, who lead the departmental security function. And really, they enable that strong security culture by setting the tone from the top and making sure that they're managing departmental security programs that align with GC security objectives. And of course, we have our designated official for cybersecurity. So we have our docs, who provides that departmental-wide strategic leadership, coordination, and oversight for making sure that cybersecurity requirements are integrated as part of the IT service delivery and planning and responding to cybersecurity events. And they work closely with the CIO and the CISO in terms of managing these activities in support of the deputy head. So what else are we doing? I always like to start off with this slide in the context of the pillars of secure GCDigital. We often talk about confidentiality, integrity, and availability in the context of information security. But I also think it's really important to focus on people, process, technology. As Bob mentioned earlier, we do have a shortage in cyber skills and talent, and it's important that we have the people to do the work. In terms of processes, making sure we have robust, streamlined processes goes a long way. And I'll touch on a couple of the processes that we are working on. And certainly technology, enables the delivery of secure and reliable services. And finally, of course, from a Treasury perspective, policy is quite important for us. Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat is a central agency and the administrative arm of the Government of Canada. And so we set the rules on how people, public funds, and government assets are managed. And for me, it's an opportunity to really set the direction and the rules for cybersecurity in the GC. So this is just a glance at our Treasury Board policy framework. We have legislation, so our policies are anchored under the Financial Administration Act. So we have we have the policy and government security, which is really those foundational security requirements, and we have the policy on service digital. And underneath each of these overarching policies, we have the directives. So the directive on security management, the directive on identity management, and under the PSD, the directive on service and digital. And there's other instruments that follow underneath, but these are largely the mandatory requirements that are set out within the Financial Administration Act that really sets out how we have those authorities to set up those rules to manage and administer the GC. And so in the context of Treasury policies as well, while we do kind of fall under the FAA, our specific policy instruments are actually really focused on Section 2 of the Financial Administration Act. So while the Government of Canada is very large in the context of many federal institutions, our actual policy instruments and our authorities under the TBS Office of the Chief Information Officer really falls under schedules. It's schedules 1, 1.1, 2, and 4 and 5 under the policy and government security. And if you've been paying attention, we are looking at exploring how we could extend our policy instruments to the greatest extent possible to other agencies, those that aren't currently under scope. There's a National Securities Intelligence Committees of Parliamentarians cyber defense report that was recently released in February. And out of that, there was a set of recommendations. It did highlight that the Government of Canada is doing well in terms of cyber defense, but it's only covering, of course, these 110 some organizations. So in light of that, some of the recommendations were like, how do we make sure we extend the benefits that we have for these cyber defense services to not only these institutions, but all the institutions under the Government of Canada's umbrella. So that's a work underway. And so that report's also available online, should you wish to read it. All right, so let's dive in a little bit into the policy on government security. Again, as I mentioned, it is those foundational security requirements that are established within the policy on government security. And we operationalize some of the components within the policy on service and digital, and in particular, the IT security control. But certainly other elements do have an impact as it relates to cybersecurity and in terms of service delivery as well. For example, making sure that, if we're establishing security, we're establishing contracts, that you're making sure that we have security considerations, the security requirements, as well as other components like cyber event management, and making sure we are addressing and dealing with vendors who have a robust incident management plan in place. So in particular, under the Directive on Service and Digital, we have departments who are, we've set out the direction that departments are responsible for ensuring that cybersecurity requirements and appropriate risk-based measures are applied continuously in an identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover approach to protect information systems and services. And so really that's kind of, setting out the foundation as part of our cybersecurity framework. And you might see some, similarities in terms of the framework because it is based on the NIST cybersecurity framework, but it's contextualized for the Government of Canada. The framework sets up those guidelines and best practices to help organizations build and improve their cybersecurity posture. So why reinvent the wheel when there's lots of benefits and lots of great work that our partners in the US have already put in place? And so we're repurposing that for the Government of Canada. And so really these pillars that we talk about, right? From an identify perspective, it's important that we identify and manage security risks. We want to make sure that organizations understand those assets that they have, right? Because it's really hard to protect when you don't know what you have. Making sure there's clear roles and responsibilities. I touched on a little bit of the R's and R's in a previous slide, but really making sure that within your organization, you also have clear R's and R's, roles and responsibilities outlined, because that really helps in terms of managing cyber, and especially if there's a cyber event, like who do you talk to? So that's something that it's important to put in place. And really making sure that you have other risk management frameworks, managing supply chain as part of the identify pillar. Under the protect pillar, it's really important to implement measures to reduce the security risks, right? So outlining and establishing appropriate safeguards to ensure the delivery of critical services. And we need to make sure that our systems and applications are designed and deployed securely, and making sure you're managing those risks as part of that. So for example, leveraging a IT security risk management framework, such as the ITSG 33 supported by and published by the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, goes a long way. And it's not just about the controls, it's about the process as well. Really making sure you have that secure systems engineering approach. Of course, we also have to plan for bad things happening. So we need to make sure that we detect and understand cyber events that are, that might come across our systems. We need to make sure that we're logging all the data and making sure that, when we see malicious behavior, we're able to identify it quickly. And for those GC organizations out there, we would encourage you to sign up for host-based services and cyber defense services from the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, because that really goes a long way in terms of providing that protection to your organization. And finally, the last pillar is really focused on responding and recovering from cyber events, making sure that we have the appropriate actions, activities identified in terms of responding to a detected security event. And that'll really help us be able to contain any events that are identified. And of course, recovering from as well. So putting in place the mitigation measures and then being able to restore, from no good backups, as an example, as part of your mitigation strategy. So plan for breach, assume breach, plan accordingly. All right. And so other frameworks that we've adopted, in terms of how do we move forward, we have, our NIST cybersecurity framework or our GC cybersecurity framework, really setting out these sort of the key principles to manage cybersecurity in the context of, from a technology perspective, how do we move forward, and really how do we protect our information and those key assets that are processed within our environment. And so we've adopted a zero trust security framework. Again, lots of great work that our partners have done in the US, and this is largely the similar pillars that are available identified as part of the NIST cybersecurity framework, or sorry, the NIST zero trust framework. So it includes pillars for users, devices, networks, applications, and monitoring. And again, making sure that we're protecting our data fundamentally. So zero trust is a security concept that's centered on the belief that organizations should not automatically trust anything inside or outside its perimeters, and instead must verify anything and everything trying to connect to its systems before granting access. And why is this important? With today's increased adoption of mobile and cloud, where work is increasingly done outside the safety of our corporate network, the legacy castle and moat approaches with a network perimeter is really increasingly difficult to enforce. So again, it's about making sure we have a different approach, a different mindset in terms of protecting our information and having an information-centric approach to support different ways of working. So, to sum it up briefly, never trust, always verify. And so it's not really I would say an evolution, but it's really, or if a revolution is really an evolution, right? We have a lot of foundational building blocks in place, and we just need to keep evolving and modernizing them along the way to make sure that we really are protecting our assets. Again, why is this important in terms of zero trust, right? It's all about enabling the future of work. We're talking about digital government transformation. Well, what does the future of work look like? And so for us, zero trust is a must for the future of work. It'll help to support that distributed, flexible, and productive workforce. We want to make sure that users are able to work anywhere, be able to connect securely, and be able to access the information that they need to have if they're allowed to have it, and depending on the context for which they're coming from. So really making sure we have those digital policies and enforcing them as appropriate based on certain conditions. And so that'll help us manage risks to protection of GC assets and information in offsite environments. So to us, zero trust is really that enabler, and we need to make sure that we're moving forward with zero trust and supporting our future work and digital transformation. So how are we doing this? A lot of the work they're doing is through, from a policy perspective. We're trying to raise the bar through policy by evolving what we call our GC IT security baseline configurations. I touched a little bit on the Directive on Service and Digital. And in May 2022, we did actually publish a new appendix called Appendix G on the standard on enterprise IT service common configurations. This standard sets out the expectations for the management of a wide range of IT components essential to enterprise IT services, such as endpoints, websites, web services, email services, account management, domain management, domain name services, APIs, printers, remote access services, and cloud services as well. So really, I'll be going through each of these components. I'll be starting with the users. So I'm following the sort of zero trust principles that I laid out before. So users, devices, networks, applications, and data, and walking through each of those pillars and how we're putting in place in those key requirements that we've outlined as part of our configuration requirements. So for example, users, we want to make sure that we're managing user accounts in a lifecycle approach, right? So if users have left a department, you really need to disable those accounts. So you have to have processes in place to support that. We want to make sure that at a minimum, multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication is enabled to protect, number one, most importantly, those privileged accounts, right? So those that have privileged access to your systems must have MFA. Users who are remotely accessing your environment also need to have MFA. And definitely for what we call our systems that have a level of assurance 3 or above should also have MFA enabled. Making sure you have these privileges for users and administrators. So those are just some of the things that we've outlined as part of our account management configuration requirements. From a device perspective, again, for us, it's really about leveraging wherever possible managed devices. That really goes a long way in terms of protecting government assets and information. Making sure your devices have the right sort of hardening in terms of locking down those services, only enabling services that are required, protecting data at rest by encryption. So that's outlined in our portable data storage requirements, and really making sure that we are protecting our endpoints from known and unknown malicious activity wherever possible. And that goes back to making sure we have host protection installed, such as the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity's Cyber Defense Services, but also from malware protection as well. And of course, making sure you're actually maintaining those systems by patching. So you might see a theme as well, patch, patch, patch. This is what I will always support and emphasize, because that really helps to reduce your attack surface. In the context of networks, again, really emphasizing that we want to make sure that when remote access is put in place, that it's done securely, and definitely leveraging those centralized services that are offered from our shared service Canada really goes a long way. Patching those services, right? We've seen some other events happening with other VPN solutions. So you have to make sure that you address them when the notifications are released. Make sure you're monitoring them and patching if you have those products. All right, and so from an application perspective, so we've done a lot of work in terms of securing cloud by establishing our GC Cloud guardrails. We have guardrails for the security of a tenant, but also we have guardrails for our M365 environment, Microsoft 365. I know a lot of folks are using Teams. We're using Zoom today, but definitely Microsoft 365 the adoption of that was accelerated across the government of Canada. And so we want to make sure that departments were implementing those services securely. From an email management services configuration perspective, we actually identified and reinforced the implementation of DMARC, so domain message authentication, reporting, and compliance. And that will really help us, that really has helped us prevent spoofing of government domains. And we also have tools to support the monitoring of that and making sure that we have coverage in terms of tracking compliance to some of these policies as well. And really from a system management configuration perspective, again, patch, patch, patch. So we do have patch management guidance that's available on our canada.ca page. And it's about really protecting our assets and doing so by patching our hardware and software. A couple of other items, websites and web services. It's important for us to make sure that our public facing services do have TLS 1.2 or above implemented and configured, and that you're using the right right crypto, the right ciphers, and putting in place the right measures to protect the transactions that are processed within the services that are offered to Canadians from the government perspective. From a data perspective, as I mentioned, we do have our Microsoft 365 guardrails in terms of the context of the data being processed. We do actually have another standard, the standard on managing information management systems, and that's I believe it's in process, if not already published, and definitely again protecting the information assets. Of course, we have the requirements already outlined from an information management security perspective under our policy on government security. So there's lots of, I would say, requirements that already exist. And so the goal with these configuration requirements is just to really reinforce and really be in some cases more specific on what we're looking for in terms of configuring our services securely to protect our assets. And of course, it's important that we monitor as well. So from the Government Canada's perspective, we're supported by Shared Service Canada, as well as from an infrastructure security perspective, as well as the Security Operations Center, which is hosted within the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. So in order for us to be able to monitor, we need to make sure we're identifying and enabling events, because it's really hard to help a department or an organization recover if we don't know what happened, right? So making sure you establish your event logging strategy, and there's also guidance available. And we also have a cybersecurity event management plan. So that's the Government of Canada's plan. And I'll touch on that in the next couple slides, but really making sure you have an incident response plan put in place. So we have one at the GC level, and then departments should also have one within their own organizations. So lots of, I would say, components that are available today in our policy suites, in our configuration requirements that really raise the bar on cybersecurity within the government of Canada. And so cybersecurity event management. So as I mentioned previously, assume breach, plan accordingly. So we need to, it's better to prepare for an event before it happens. And so the cybersecurity event management plan provides us with that operational framework for the management of security events, including cyber threats, vulnerabilities, or incidents that impact or threaten the GC's ability to deliver programs and services to Canadians. Really, as part of our process, there's 4 phases, as you can see here. So we have preparation, detection and assessment, mitigation, recovery, and post-event activity. So certainly, as part of this throughout this life cycle, we are regularly reporting up to our executives, our senior officials, to make sure that there's situational awareness when bad things are happening, so we can quickly identify measures to put in place to prevent any bleeding. So that's certainly a lot of work. And as I said at the beginning, we've been quite busy, lots of events, and as even the 0 days, there may not have ultimately led to an incident, but definitely we're going to be preventing that by addressing and making sure that anybody who has that bad software or that bad application is aware and are putting in place the right measures to protect their systems and the information process within those systems. And I think it's important as well from a post-event activity. So when things do happen, that we do conduct your postmortems, your lessons learned, so that you can continuously improve your activities, clarify roles and responsibilities. And so as much as we do have a CSEMP that's published annually, it was published there, but we definitely review it on a regular basis, and we update it to make sure that we are including the best practices, any lessons learned. For example, in the CSEMP, we are also including roles for our third-party suppliers, right? So it's important that we do have an engagement with any third parties that are supporting the government of Canada, because they process the information of the GC, and we entrust them to protect our information assets, even if it's not on our own systems on premise, as an example. So lots of work there, and it's something that it's a mess, so that it's not always flexed, but definitely being prepared really goes a long way. So within the CSEMP, just to highlight sort of the different levels where we sort of kick in from a TBS perspective. At level 1 is really that day-to-day operations in the government of Canada. So it's a really departmental focus. And really where TBS works closely with the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity is at level 2 and at level 3. So level 2 indicating the heightened attention that's required, and level 3 really that immediate focus that's required at the GC level. So a lot of time is spent on level 2, level 3, but certainly we haven't fortunately had to deal with level 4, at least since I've been here. But definitely it's that's level 4 is where we would most certainly work with our Government Operations Center under public safety. So there's a lot of great partnership across the government of Canada in supporting cybersecurity event management. So within the GC, and public safety is doing lots of great work in terms of the sort of the outward facing non-GC cyber event and incident response management as well. All right. And so we've been talking a lot about sort of the processes and plans put in place, but it's important to understand, are these things working? Right. So from, we've been talking a lot about these different framework strategies, but ultimately it's about managing IT security risks, right? So we just set a lot of direction at the top, working with departments and developing, strategies and designs, making sure that they're considering security right from the outset. And so if we can set sort of the framework at the high level from a GC perspective, then, the goal is to really download that to departments so they can manage those systems within their organizations and leverage the guidance that's being provided from the central agency perspective. And then, as I mentioned, there's a departmental lens in terms of managing the department, but also the information system security perspective. And so, it's important that, as you're designing and setting up new application systems, you're really establishing and putting in place a systems development lifecycle process. Security really should be integrated throughout that process and not at the end as a bolt-on, because that's more costly. And I think it's important that, how to manage costs, right? And doing things like threat modeling and making sure you're really understanding what your design is and addressing any, doing the threat modeling and identifying any sort of, venues of attack and making sure you have the right controls put in place. And so really focusing on those key priorities, key areas, and investing in those, right? So that's done through threat modeling as an example. And of course, continuously monitoring your systems. And then, it's important to get that feedback loop as, we go up the chain. And so, what does that look like from a security metrics perspective at the information system perspective? How does that feed into your departmental plan? And then how does it, from a GC perspective, what are the areas that we need to kind of focus on to help departments improve cyber and IT security within their organizations? And all this is kind of influenced by, on the left-hand side, different, our policy requirements, the business needs, the threat information, best practices, and lessons learned, as I touched on in previous slides. So that feedback loop is really, really important. And finally, in terms of our cyber maturity self-assessment, we did actually launch a new tool. It is based on our cybersecurity management framework. They identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And so the goal here is, it's not necessarily to punish departments, it's really to actually gain visibility, because a lot of times it's hard to sort of get the data from these organizations. It allows us to provide that view of the maturity of cybersecurity in the government of Canada. It allows us to, prioritize any policy decisions, training to help departments. And, departments themselves are looking at it in terms of, how can they improve within their own organization. So it's a tool to guide organizations in prioritizing cybersecurity actions themselves as well. And so this is our first year in terms of launching this tool. And we'll be looking, we've asked departments to complete that as part of their departmental plan for service and digital. So really making sure that, cybersecurity is not a standalone, it's really part of the delivery of secure services and really part of that framework in terms of our policy on service and digital. All right, key takeaways. Okay, so in the context of the government of Canada, we do have lots of threats that are affecting us, and they're persistent, and they affect not just our organization, but everywhere around the world, governments, private sectors, etc. We have the GC has connected systems and tools in place to monitor, detect, investigate potential threats, and take active measures to address and neutralize them. And together we work with, not only with, of course, with CBS, SSC, and CC, but with departments as well to ensure that the government's cybersecurity risk posture is current and effective. The GC is continuously working to enhance cybersecurity by identifying and making sure that we're protecting against all these incidents. And when bad things do happen, we learn from them and we put in place and update our guidance and our policy instruments as needed to address those lessons learned from those cyber events. And this is the reason why it makes security boring again. I think it's funny because of the fact that it's been quite busy. And for us, I love to, not be so busy. And if we can make it boring, then maybe that we're doing something good, right? So it's important to be aware. The government of Canada is a target. Departments and its users must be vigilant and should be provided with ongoing training. So be mindful of that email. Just make sure you're checking that email address. Is it legit? And don't click on it if it seems suspicious, and report that as well. Be proactive, know what your assets are and protect them accordingly. Make sure that you have technology that's in place to protect malicious software and keep that software up to date. And then protecting those accounts that are used to access your systems by implementing things like two-factor authentication. And then certainly being prepared. Ensure that you have a plan in place and test it regularly.
Well, thank you very much, Pope. That was a great presentation. Greatly appreciated. Certainly a lot of material there, and your passion shines through with every statement you make, this sort of thing. I've got a couple of quick questions, and then we'll go to the next one, next presentation on the zero trust. How do you ensure that governmental institutions are following the proposed frameworks and policies? Is there sort of an internal audit process as part of governance?
So that's exactly what we're doing as part of the cyber maturity self-assessment. That's one of the measures. we do have our departmental plan on service digital that outlines the I would say the key requirements for which we are monitoring and tracking. But under the sort of the framework within the Government of Canada, there is a compliance framework as well, the management of compliance or something like that. But there is already measures put in place, and we have other tools like the management accountability framework that also is used to measure compliance to our policies.
So you basically have a cyber audit security framework in place? You're
Well,
using the Osaka one, or
not explicitly, but that's an area. I mean, we do have audits in the context of we do have our our internal auditors. We have the OAG who does auditing. But from a TBS perspective, we focus a lot on the policy compliance. So we'll be auditing in terms of monitoring compliance to that.
okay.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, it was great presentation. People are they very much appreciated everything you presented, and it was a great deal of material, but it's certainly food for thought, and people will want to get access to the documents per se. So anyways, you can also Google, you can also go to gc.canada. I mean, basically go to the website, all the documents have been posted. So anyways, this concludes this particular session. I would like to give a heartfelt thank you to Poe to coming out and giving a presentation. Hopefully next year we'll hear the progress that has been made and where it's going. But in the meantime, I ask all of you, we have another presentation coming up in the cyber stream. It's from the Open Group. John Linford and Altaz Balani will be talking about an open standard for zero trust architecture. And certainly that's the way of the future. And that's something that you should be aware of when you're planning your architectures and putting your security in place. So without further ado, thank you very much, Poe. And I will end the streaming session now. There we go. Thank you.